Okay. Owen, shall I start now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. I am super excited about this program. I'm Joan Maurer, co-chairman of the program committee of the PDCA. And my other co-chairman of the program committee is none other than Nick Call, who is a professor of public diplomacy at USC and is probably the biggest promoter of public diplomacy we have in the academic world, at least. He's just done a great job of bringing lots of subjects, fascinating subjects, both to the PDCA and to other venues. Today, he's going to be looking and talking about classical music as cultural diplomacy. And I think we all understand that cultural affairs are such a key part of public diplomacy, and Nick has been pushing this. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to him, and I look forward to a really exciting program. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks very much. So thanks, Joan. So welcome, everybody. We've got three speakers today. Leading things off will be Carol Hess, who's Distinguished Professor of Musicology at the University of California, Davis. And she's just published a terrific book called Aaron Copland in Latin America, Music and Cultural Politics. She's also the author of Experiencing Latin American Music and Representing the Good Neighbor, Music Difference and the Pan-American Dream. And I think that's a wonderful way to start things off. And then responding, we have Carla Canales, who is Senior Advisor and Envoy for Cultural Exchange at the President's Committee for Arts and the Humanities, also an Arts Envoy for the Department of State and Fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School. And Carla's a well-known educator, cultural diplomat, arts advocate, author, nonprofit entrepreneur, who has regularly undertaken cultural diplomacy missions, including to China. And also responding is Pauline Yang, a distinguished music diplomat who has frequently played at US embassies around the world. And from undergraduate days at USC, Pauline has always mixed the study of music with the study of international relations. She has master's degrees in piano performance from USC and in international relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, and right now is joining us from Vienna. So thank you very much for choosing Vienna, choosing Zoom over and above beautiful Vienna. So welcome, everybody. But now if I could turn to Carol to just kick things off, talking a little bit about your book on Aaron Copland. Thanks, Carol. Over to you.
And thank you very much, everyone, for inviting me to participate in this exciting panel. Today, I'd like to consider three principal questions that I've addressed in this recent book that Nick kindly mentioned on the U.S. classical composer Aaron Copland and his cultural diplomacy in Latin America. Why classical music? Why Copland? Why Latin America? I try to make the case for viewing cultural diplomacy not just in terms of international relations, which is certainly the business of many of you here today, but also as an aspect of music history and criticism. So first, we'd want to ask why music should play a role in cultural diplomacy. I realize that's a question that you've all thought about, but musicologists began studying this phenomenon in the past 20 years or so. And in doing so, we've naturally debated the very definition of cultural diplomacy. Some of us call it public diplomacy. Some of us call it cultural diplomacy. I will leave that to the experts, the non-musicologists, to make that call. So what is it? The endeavor to unite diverse peoples through deeply felt experiences of art. In the case of classical music, is it a way to showcase the elite culture of a nation, which was especially important in the case of the United States, which suffered from a cultural inferiority complex well into the 20th century? Is it the means by which one country promotes to other nations, or perhaps imposes upon them its own cultural values? So it's a power relationship as well. So I think it's safe to say that these questions are especially compelling when we consider them in terms of classical music. In most instances, classical music is considered a non-representational art that lacks explicit meaning. And this status of classical music as aloof, gritty, and messiness of politics has prevailed since the 19th century. At that time, it was enshrined in the concept of absolute music. That is the idea that music depends not on literary or philosophical or other extra-musical associations, but on its own autonomous structures. And these could include musical form, instrumentation, harmony, and other elements of music. So as a result, absolute music generally implies some level of specialized training. Yet listeners, including those with scant formal education in music, are nonetheless quick to attach meaning to musical works, even if it has taken musicologists a comparatively long time to take this reality seriously. And these meanings can vary, of course, from one constituency or nation state to another, sometimes suggesting meanings that departments of state or other cultural actors would never have intended. In other words, the old saw, music is the universal language, which is widely proclaimed by performers, music appreciation teachers. My elementary school teacher 100 years ago used to say music is the universal language all the time, and also by government officials. That old saw is tested whenever musicians take up the duties of cultural diplomacy. When it comes to Latin America, it's worth pointing out that the first musicologists to study cultural diplomacy and its music focused on the East-West divide during the Cold War. Now, this was certainly a fruitful topic. It embraced not only classical music, but jazz especially, and later on, rock music and folk music. Yet, as this forum knows very well, Latin America was the testing ground for government-sponsored U.S. cultural diplomacy. Under the auspices of the Good Neighbor policy, President Franklin Roosevelt vowed to seek common bonds among the Americas, with his administration promising to smooth over long-standing tensions with Latin America by renouncing military and commercial interventionism in the region. And all of this was engineered to present a united front against European fascism and to counteract Axis infiltration in the hemisphere. Music and cultural diplomacy more generally was part of this effort. In the aftermath of World War II and the Allied victory, however, identifying the enemy of the hemisphere became more complicated. Whereas communism was the great foe of the United States, at least some Latin American countries were receptive to its precepts. And when the United States began propping up dictators who were tough on communism, that is, they were resuming the interventionism that they briefly gave up, many Latin Americans concluded that good neighborliness had been motivated by expediency rather than by sincerity. Still, the United States practiced musical diplomacy with Latin America throughout both the Good Neighbor period and the Cold War. And much of the emphasis was on classical music, with tours by symphony orchestras, classical performers, opera, and ballet companies. In other words, cultural actors north and south were confident in the power of classical music, excuse me, to persuade, to smooth over tensions, and perhaps to serve as a distraction from more potent antagonisms. So in my efforts to understand these shifts of perceptions, I made a methodological decision, whereas many musicologists had previously approached cultural diplomacy via State Department reports, some of which are rather self-congratulatory, and all of which reflect a US-centric perspective. I aimed to solicit the opinions of Latin American critics. First, I dug up hundreds of Spanish and Portuguese language press reports, either at the Library of Congress or in Latin American newspaper archives. And then I analyzed the reactions of these critics, often in terms of contemporaneous political events or currents, and also the readerships of the papers or magazines in which the reviews appear. Was the paper Nazi funded? Was it left-leaning? Was it Catholic? Was it US friendly? Was it middle of the road? A whole host of possible associations. And I also tried to weigh the background, the training, and the aesthetic or political leanings of many Latin American critics, some of whom are unknown to musicologists in the United States, with the overarching goal being to include Latin Americans in my study as much as possible. Now, of course, I recognize that the fact that I am fluent in Spanish and my Portuguese is decent does not entitle me to speak for Latin Americans, but I endeavored to allow these critics to speak for themselves as much as possible. And so now the question, why Copland? All of these developments coincided with the career of Aaron Copland, who lived from 1900 to 1990. He was perhaps the best-known U.S. classical composer of the 20th century. You may or may not have a Copland sound in your ear that derives from any of his compositions, but if you've heard Navy recruitment ads on TV commercials, you know this sound. Open harmonies, singable melodies. It's often dubbed an Americana style for its capacity to evoke images such as the horizons of the Great Plains, barn dances, or can-do American spirit. The irony, of course, was that Copland was a left-leaning homosexual Jew born in Brooklyn. And he also got in trouble with McCarthy during the HUAC hearings. This reality, this irony, I should say, still seems to be lost on some. I recommend to your attention a fairly recent article in Atlantic Monthly titled, "Republicans Keep Misusing Aaron Copland's Music." During the period I've just outlined, Copland visited Latin America 4 times as a cultural diplomat under the auspices of the U.S. government. He went many times to Latin America, especially Mexico, as a private citizen. And each time he met Latin American classical composers, he listened to their music, he performed his symphonic and chamber works, and he appeared in the media. Back home, he wrote detailed reports for the State Department. He composed several Latin American themed works, and he recommended Latin American composers for exchange visits to the United States. In each of these activities, he defended an aesthetic, one that was exemplified in his own music. Some critics, North and South, condemned Copland's accessible music as middlebrow, although others defended it as an antidote to what they perceived to be the excesses of the avant-garde. In short, Copland fundamentally shaped reaction to Latin American classical music in the United States. He did so especially with regard to nationalism and modernism, 2 potent and antagonistic aesthetic orientations that have shaped much of the music of the Americas. Overtly nationalist composers, North or South, were considered old-fashioned for their prominent use of folk idioms or dance rhythms, a practice linked to 19th century Romanticism. Modernism, a more abstract and therefore identity-neutral orientation, promised greater international status, which was a welcome goal for the so-called peripheral countries of the Americas. It all came down to finding the appropriate balance. But those who tried their hand at modernism, especially Latin American composers, risked antagonizing their compatriots. Some of them were even accused of, quote, crimes against the nation, as the Brazilian composer Mozart Camargo Guarnieri railed in 1950 when some of his compatriots ventured into serialism, perhaps the most common tendency of the avant-garde at mid-century. So again, why classical music? To evaluate through music some of these shifting tensions of the Good Neighbor period and the Cold War is both telling and refreshing. Reactions to Copland's music and to music of the United States more generally rose and fell in some surprising ways. Certainly in the United States, many critics and scholars had typed Copland as a nationalist for his frequent quotations of cowboy songs, folk tunes, and the like. But not all of his pieces take this approach. Indeed, an Argentine critic writing for the US-friendly newspaper La Nación heard in Copland's outdoor overture for symphony orchestra and without overtly nationalist elements, quote, the energetic soul of Copland's people. Another critic found the work filled with, quote, dynamic optimism. This was all when it was performed in Buenos Aires at the height of the Good Neighbor period. On the other hand, the author of a review in an anti-Semitic paper funded by Germany, and certainly aware of Copland's Jewish heritage, called the same work motley, and also claimed that an outdoor overture revealed Copland to be, quote, a romantic disguised as a modernist. Another anti-US paper called US cultural diplomacy, quote, a powerful arm of the media, an instrument of penetration and domination. In other words, during the Good Neighbor period, many Latin American critics celebrated kinship with the Colossus of the North as others attacked Copland's works as aesthetically deficient, redolent of US hegemony, or both. During the Cold War, when fear of US hegemony pervaded many more circles in Latin America, these divisions only intensified. For example, his Lincoln portrait for speaker and orchestra, viewed in the United States as a declaration of unabashed, some would even say unsubtle, patriotism. But in Argentina, where he traveled again in 1947, it was considered an endorsement of Juan Domingo Perón, who was no friend of the State Department, possibly because critics drew comparisons between Lincoln's trajectory and Perón's. It also enjoyed mythic status when some listeners became convinced that Lincoln portrait had, quote, started the revolution that brought down the Venezuelan dictator, General Marcos Pérez Jiménez, with a performance in Caracas in 1957. These differences of opinion offer one more pretext for chipping away at music's status as an autonomous edifice accessible only through its form, timbre, instrumentation, harmony, etc., to those in the know. They also enhance our understanding of Copland's music, its range of meaning, and its communicative power. So to wrap up, as a postscript, I'd like to add a few thoughts on what Copland's Latin American experience might mean for musical life today. Despite his efforts, and despite a greater presence in post-secondary music programs, Nick was kind enough to refer to my textbook on Latin American music, Latin American classical music continues to be marginalized. A Latin American themed concert could honor the work of cultural diplomacy by kicking off with some of the music by composers involved in good neighborly relations. I'm thinking here not just of Copland, but of the US composer Henry Cowell, who wrote Fanfare for the Forces of Our Latin American Allies, or the Argentine composer Alberto Ginastera, who composed the 12 Preludios Americanos, 12 American preludes. Another possibility, many concertgoers in the United States have admired the famous Concerto for Orchestra by the Hungarian composer Béla Bartók, written in the 1940s in the United States, where he sought refuge from European fascism. But several Latin American composers also wrote concertos for orchestra, including José María Castro, Antonio Esteves, Ricardo Lorenz, and Roberto Sierra. There's also the fact that we need to bring more repertory from manuscript to live performance. In 1947, when Copland heard Guarnieri's prize-winning second-string quartet, he called it a good playable work. Today, it is still available only in manuscript. Another matter is image. Works such as Cuban Overture by Gershwin and Latin American Sinfonette by Morton Gould evoke a pleasant tourist experience, in part because their creators rejected modernism. In doing so, however, they reinforce the notion that Latin American music is something other than advanced. We in the United States could showcase more works by the Latin American avant-garde of the 20th and 21st centuries, perhaps taking as a starting point composers Copland met in the 1960s, Edgar Valcárcel of Peru, Gustavo Becerra of Chile, Roque Cordero of Panama, or Juan Orrego Salas, also from Chile. We could also give greater profile to living Latin American composers, Gabriela Ortiz of Mexico, Josi de Oliveira of Brazil, Daniel León, Cuba, Chañaral Ortega Miranda, also from Chile, Pablo Ortiz from Argentina, and many others. All are worthy not just for artistic merit, but because their works can also help correct this still persistent representation of Latin American classical music. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much, Carol. At this point, I'd like to bring in Carla to talk a little bit about what you're doing right now and what your recent experiences have been with classical music as diplomacy.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Call, and thank you, Carol. That was just fantastic. I enjoyed your remarks and want to really echo and champion what you've said there. So I am a classical opera singer by training. I have dual citizenship as a Mexican and American, and have worked as an arts envoy for state for almost 20 years. And I think to answer Professor Cole's question, most recently, I'm currently involved in a 7-month-long process, a project that I'm working on with the embassy in Beijing, to essentially utilize digital diplomacy through virtual classes once a week, where I'm working with the Zheng Xiaoying Opera Center in Xiamen, bringing American opera singers online and educators and other professionals, to not only talk about opera singing, which is of course on the rise in China in popularity, but technique and career advice and casting considerations and so forth over the course of these 7 months. And the trip culminates with my going to China to do some work in person there. I'm tremendously excited about the project for a variety of reasons, but I will say, just echoing on what Carol's saying here, as someone who's worked in the space for some time, I think that most often the opportunity that we miss is the exchange. That, it not only behooves us as Americans to be able to learn from the countries that we're going to, with the ideals of cultural diplomacy and furthering the foreign policy objectives and so forth, but also to learn from them, to take something back with us when we come back to the United States and are able to share those lessons. And I think we don't often construct cultural diplomacy programming in that collaborative or dialogue didactic fashion. So it's something that I'm trying to do kind of on my own here. But I guess the last thing I'll say along those lines is, as an artist who's interested in this work, and I'll defer also to Pauline's opinion, I think there are very, very few resources, academic or otherwise, in how to build a career around this work and how to specifically establish programming that can achieve not only the foreign policy objectives that enable this work to happen, but also the exchange work that I'm sort of alluding to here. It's not something that's taught in music schools traditionally, and it requires a lot of creative thinking. And if I may, I just want to share one more story. During the Trump administration, I was asked to do a program with the embassy in Honduras. And of course, due to COVID, the program shifted to become a virtual program. And often, to give an example of this, I'm contacted sort of by request and asked, can you put together a program? What does that mean? I could just go and perform opera arias, or American arias or musical theater, but is that really going to get at the root of what we're trying to do with cultural diplomacy? I see this work as not only being about forging a mutual understanding, but furthering the foreign policy objectives. And in this particular case, I was given objectives of, again, during the Trump administration, anti-corruption, anti-immigration, really driving those 2 points home with 3rd through 5th graders. So that was the specific mission of my my project. And what I decided to do, sort of churning this around in my head a bit as an artist, I created a program called Campo de Valores, or the Values Camp. And so every week online, we would look at a different good value, or, things like integrity, kindness, being, a clean citizen, picking up litter, things like this. So every week we looked at a value and we sang songs about it. I created songs, we, looked at stories and ultimately had the kids record videos where they're singing their version or dancing to their version of the songs, because fundamentally that's what our two countries have in common. Not the anti-corruption or anti-immigration, but rather we all want to be good citizens of our country. And what does that mean? So it's a long-winded answer, Professor Call, but I hope that gives a little bit of context to why this work is important to me.
No, for sure. I think that's very helpful. But I wonder if you could share the story about coming face to face with the child in China, because I know you've used that in other places, but I think that's a very powerful example of how music can connect.
Well, certainly, yeah. I mean, it was a very important example for me. I don't know that I would completely attribute music, but it certainly is what got me there. Last summer, I was invited, not by the US Embassy, but rather but I was a part of a tour that was organized by the city of Fujian, China, to bring American musicians and international musicians to China to perform. And I was there with a number of global musicians, sort of performing in different cities. And as we went into the mountains of Fujian, we went to what are known as these Tulo villages, which are rather small villages, really deep in the mountains. And my colleagues and I were kind of visiting one of them, and I saw a young boy kind of looking out of a window while we were just wrapping up watching a puppet show, and I could tell he was, looking at us, probably, maybe, I'm assuming he hadn't seen a lot of foreigners in his village. And I sort of decided to go up to him and strike a conversation with his mother's approval, and it turned out he spoke beautiful English. And in that exchange, we decided to become pen pals. And it was kind of a leap of faith, I would say, from his side, as maybe 7-year-old boy. And for myself, just wanting to engage, off the beaten path in a very authentic way. Before I made it back onto the bus, as I was leaving, he ran to meet me at the bus and had a beautiful gift for me. And he shared this word with me, je yin, which I did not know. And je comes from the meaning, as I understand it in Mandarin, to know or to understand, and yin means music. And the phrase I learned is, it literally means I understand the music in you, or I know the music in you. It comes from an ancient story, which, if we have time, I'll get into more, but I did write a piece about this as an op-ed. And I think that idea remains very, very powerful to me, that this young boy taught me a lesson, saying, I understand the music in you. And we did understand each other very well. But the larger lesson, the meta lesson there is, can we, as two countries, understand the music in each of us? And that doesn't mean that we always agree. That doesn't mean, but it does mean that we seek to listen.
Yes.
And I would just really close with that thought. I know earlier we were talking about music as a universal language. I see this point a little differently, which I know is not the norm, but I don't think of music or classical Western music as our universal language. I think our universal language as human beings is our emotional realm, our capacity to feel, be it sadness or joy or pain, sorrow, laughter. What music and the arts allow us is a safe place to contemplate and better understand the human condition and these emotions. There are substantial differences, let's say, in the Western or Eastern scales, the use of halftone, the quarter tones, and so forth. But we all have music as human beings, and that is an expression of our emotion. And so, therein really lies the opportunity for us to listen and understand each other in a more profound way.
Thank you very much. That's just lovely. That's beautiful. Pauline, over to you. I mean, because I think your personal music diplomacy is included not only playing for American embassies, but you also performed at NATO and at other venues. How have you experienced these themes in your own practice?
Sure, and thank you for having me on such a distinguished panel. I'm so impressed and amazed by all of you. And my arts envoy work with the State Department has been also ongoing since, not nearly as long as Carla's been doing this, but since about 2015 or so. And I've done 6 trips for the State Department, Japan, Ethiopia, Portugal, Taiwan, Nigeria, and most recently NATO headquarters on behalf of the US mission to NATO. And I completely echo everything that that both Carol and Carla have spoken of just now about music and how that gets represented abroad, but also in terms of cultural diplomacy, public diplomacy. And I wanted to share some insight into particularly the NATO program, because there were a lot of things that went into the actual repertoire programming, for example, which I also had some help from Carla with in the process, which is very helpful. Because with music not necessarily being a universal language, especially in times of conflict, and in some places that might be more sensitive to certain conflicts at certain times, it just makes something even like repertoire much more sensitive as well. So, for example, when I was preparing the programs for my other public diplomacy trips, I'm usually given carte blanche to be able to perform whatever repertoire I would like to, and to perhaps just include one piece by an American composer, which seems reasonable. And that has always been the case, and no problems there. At NATO, the issue was going to be whether it would be possible to even propose including any works by Russian composers or not. And I was very grateful that Carla had advised me to not assume that it would be okay to think of music being such a great way to bring people together, because it is still very sensitive in certain parts of Europe, especially. And so I ended up, for example, proposing two separate programs, one with some Russian compositions and one without, and then also put in what I thought was going to be an internal document just for the US mission in terms of specific reasons why Rachmaninoff, why Tchaikovsky, and their particular personal relationships with the United States and with the American people, and just to at least make a case so that it wouldn't be seeming like I was just wanting to do this because I liked their music. And it ended up being included in the program, which I was glad that, I guess, the US ambassador to NATO, who's lovely, she, I guess, took to heart what I had written. And so I was glad that that got through, but I didn't find out until my plane was taking off from Washington to Brussels that the program with the Russian composers was the one that was going to be selected. And which is good, because I didn't want to be performing, for example, excerpts from the Nutcracker and being booed. So just these really critically important details that have to be taken into account. And Carol, I appreciated and loved your book so much. I learned so much through reading each section of how I loved how you separated the book into the different themes, and then specific trips and countries that Copland did, and then what some of the different objectives were in certain parts. And one of the things that I loved so much was the concept of safeguarding beauty. And that reminded me that there's so much that gets forgotten sometimes for why cultural diplomacy exists and why it needs to be continued. But it's so true that we in the arts and in cultural diplomacy and public diplomacy are very much in not only the business of, but also in doing the really important work of safeguarding beauty indeed. And I also loved how much you talked about, and also based on what Copland said too, to travel and to learn and not to preach. And Carla, you touched upon this as well, where it is very much an exchange of knowledge, of ideas, and of hopes and dreams too. And I remember on one of my trips, it was to Nigeria, and there was an event that was at a school for blind children, and the children were so excited to hear about the ways in which I had bridged music and diplomacy in both my studies and in very practical terms as well. And they came up to me afterwards and said that that opened up their possibilities for what they could do too, because a lot of them, they love music, they've studied music, many of them singing, and they said though that they didn't always know what they could do with it, and that this at least started giving them some ideas of how to combine it with something else. It doesn't have to be with diplomacy in their case, but just to not think of it as being such a siloed thing, or not just as an interest or a hobby. And then also an example in Taiwan was when our de facto US embassy there, AIT, the American Institute in Taiwan, they partnered with an educational nonprofit organization that brought a lot of children. It was, I think it was children from 5 different middle schools in the indigenous villages up in the high mountains of Taiwan, in southern Taiwan, near the city of Kaohsiung. And even though they were some of them were 2 hours from the city, many of them had never been to the city before. And some of them had never seen or heard a piano before. Some of them many of them had never been to a concert hall before. And so it was very much a learning experience for them. And then also for me as well, to hear some more in conversation about what their lives are like and what their perceptions are of the United States, and of what the US tries to project abroad, and also what interests them most about US culture, and what their hopes and dreams are. Some of which were related to going to the US someday, some of which were purely arts related, but just to even have that exchange and a possibility of learning more from each other has been very eye-opening in each of the different public diplomacy trips that I've gotten to do. So that also seems to be consistent with what I've been hearing from all the speakers today. So I'm very pleased about that. And I hope that this excellent work in the field of cultural diplomacy continues. I hope it really never stops. Oh, and if I could add one more thing, there was one thing that I wrote down, Carol, from your book, which I hope the entire audience will keep in mind. I know I'm partially preaching to the choir, because I think anyone in the PDCAA is already very much invested in PD, but nonetheless, I think this was such an important quote for us all to keep in mind. That this was a quote from a US consul in Santa Catarina, Brazil, where and he was speaking that even in times of war, should anyone say that these are war days and there is no time or money to spend on cultural trifles, and that's in quotes, I wish to put myself on record as affirming that the cultural policy as being pursued by the Division of Cultural Relations is not only the most natural basis for avoiding wars and misunderstandings, but is also the key foundation for a world peace and civilization. And then goes on to also say that this shouldn't be just a wartime assignment either. And I thought that was so powerful, and it made me feel that much more grateful to be doing this this work that I love so much, and which I think is so important for connecting peoples and cultures all over the world.
That's fantastic. I was just to go back to something Carol said. She talked about the inferiority complex of the United States as being one of the motivators for classical music figuring in American cultural diplomacy. And I was struck in the archives where I was looking at what the specialisms were of journalists who came to the United States on American embassy leader grants. I was expecting they'd be political journalists, but they weren't. They were disproportionately classical music journalists coming from the British embassy. From Britain. The U.S. embassy in London prioritized exposing British music journalists, ballet correspondents, and so forth to the American classical music and performing arts network. I think not just because of an inferiority complex, but because this was an active vector of attack from the Russians, that the Russians would say America is an uncultured place. It can't compare with the attitude to culture, the cultural excellence that we have in Russian history and in Soviet society. So, and I think sometimes American popular culture was cast in these attacks as being problematic, or something that classical music, high art, or however you want to put it, was saving the world from, or like a dam holding back American popular culture. So, but I wondered how you three relate to American popular culture and how you experience the ubiquity of American popular culture in your own work. And do you feel that you're still in some ways showing that the United States is not just Taylor Swift and Beyonce? And anybody can pick up that hot potato. if you...
Well, I'll pick it up. I may have some very different views from my colleagues here. I personally absolutely love American popular culture. I think it is a point of pride for us as Americans. I think there's a lot of wonderful creativity that's happening. And just to pick up on what you just said, Professor, you know, the new Beyonce album, Cowboy Carter, came out Friday. There's a track on it that samples, covers, if you will, Caro Mio Ben, which is a very well-known opera tune. So, you know, on some level, we're actually for the first time seeing a melding of the operatic genre with pop. And I think that that's something that's very American. The innovative approach that we take to the arts in general. I think also if you follow a lot of the more experimental, modern, classical, if you will, works. I know, Carol, you mentioned Tania Leon, who's a close friend, and some of her colleagues, but also maybe the younger generation. I'm thinking of Missy Mazzoli and some others. They're also often, you know, bringing in pop influences. I know, for instance, Caroline Shaw has done some work with some of the most eminent pop musicians. So what I think is really interesting is where we are today with these forces kind of colliding. And in particular, I found myself thinking a lot of the Cowboy Carter album, given the wonderful introduction that Carol gave us with Copland, and sort of the Americana, let's say, that could be associated with both of them, and how far we've come in this time. So for me, it's a plus. I think it doesn't have to be an either or, it's both and.
Right.
Yeah.
Carol, do you want to jump in on that one?
Yes, certainly. Thank you. Yes, I agree with Carla. When I first became deeply aware, well, one of my colleagues, Mark Katz, whose
Yes.
name you may know, he's a musicologist who's really gotten into the thick of it, like all of you. And when he began to be involved in hip hop diplomacy, he pointed out that there were many objections in principle to hip hop, misogynistic lyrics critical of law enforcement, et cetera, et cetera. But it made me realize how rhetorically flexible diplomacy can be. People were saying, well, yes, but this is a good thing because it shows that in the United States, we can criticize these institutions and we can have this freedom of language that might not exist in many other countries. And then when you see figures like Hillary Clinton embracing hip hop diplomacy, you think, well, things are, you know, this is, as Carla was saying, this is not a either or situation, but it's, you know, here's what we have, whatever works, whatever is popular. And it can be many different things, are all worth pursuing for this, essentially the same goals.
Pauline?
Sure, I love that question. And I also agree, yeah, that absolutely is not mutually exclusive. And I think whenever I'm traveling for these public diplomacy trips, I also am so proud to hear indeed that the local audiences in these different countries are so into and knowledgeable about US popular culture, and that they care to know, and that they really like a lot of it. From what I hear, makes me really happy and proud. And I do agree that that the US government has been so creative in doing different types of public diplomacy programs, which is not necessarily the case with other foreign governments. And so I've heard from several foreign government officials that they admire that the US can and even encourages putting together such a varied um, a varied array of types of programming, and that a lot of times it's all really well received across the board, whether it is hip hop diplomacy or American music abroad with some country music, for example, or when it is classical music. And even though the US might not be historically the first place that one might think of for Western classical music, because of course Europe, but that the US does still want to be a major player in that field, I think is also really important, and to not just exclude itself from that just because the roots aren't from the US. I think wouldn't be a reason to not be in it. And also, I find that a lot of times US embassies want me to talk about how in the US it's possible to do a double major, for instance. And so that, again, the creativity opens up, I mean, the possibilities of that opens up so much more space for creativity.
You yourself are an example of that.
Oh, and I've learned a lot from
we should.
I've learned a lot from you, Professor Cole.
I wanted to bring in a couple of questions have come into the Q&A, and so please if something occurs in the audience, do pop them in there. Michael Korf has asked us asks you to comment on foreign repertoire in American performances. And foreign musicians being paid by the State Department or funded by the State Department to perform in the US. Do you think that's an appropriate use of taxpayer money? I would assume, given the tone of what we've been saying so far, that you absolutely do. But how might these things be defended? Carla?
I'll jump in. Yeah, I mean, absolutely, I would defend that. First of all, it's not my decision to make, but I think, you know, I'm kind of echoing the same sentiment of trying to move our thinking toward more dialogue, a more didactic approach where we're learning and sharing. And so having musicians from abroad come here gives us an opportunity in our communities to learn about their music, their values, their culture, et cetera. And that is a very, very worthy investment, I would say. You know, we are, to make this a more nuanced, time-sensitive question, we are at a moment where, as Pauline mentioned, there are a lot of sensitivities right now, globally, facing musicians and repertoire associated with different parts of the world, notably Russian compositions, you know, and even Russian authors. I know Dostoevsky was taken off of a literary book festival when the start of the situation in Ukraine got going, and you know, so there are these forms of protest happening not just in the US but in other parts of the world. And so I think that is a question that a lot of arts organizations are grappling with, is, you know, how exactly to tackle that. But in terms of the value, we shouldn't be limiting ourselves. It's the same with classical music. We should be really looking to learn as much as we can as Americans. And this is a country, I think, that is extraordinary in its diversity and its defending of diversity at all costs. So I hope that that continues.
Carol?
I could just add that those debates started from day one, from the establishment of the Division of Cultural Relations in 1938. Many people in Congress didn't see any point in funding ballet companies to go to South America. Now we can approach the matter with hindsight, and we can look at the whole thing, and all those public cultural diplomacy cannot be, its benefits cannot necessarily be quantified in a spreadsheet. I think if we step back and look at the entire project, we would do well to adhere to what Carla has just articulated very well, that these are benefits, and therefore we pay for them.
And Pauline?
Yes, I definitely agree with all of those remarks. I also, so despite my thinking that that the foreign repertoire should be played in the United States, and that foreign artists and groups should be invited to perform in the United States, but because I can also understand how sensitive the funding issues could be, my personal recommendation, I guess, for when there are projects going on like that, just to avoid as much controversy as possible, would be to partner with perhaps some of the private or nonprofit sectors, just so it's not where it's 100% government funding, just to make the line a little bit clearer for those who are against it, perhaps.
Okay, so I'm just trying to think of a question. There are a number of questions are now coming in. But let's go to Bill. I think this is a shorter one. Bill Wanland. Thanks for the panel. Very interesting discussion. Have any of you faced protests overseas? Did Copland face protests that challenge American foreign policy or domestic social deficiencies? If so, how do you deal with it? So have you been affected by?
I guess that's me about Copland. He doesn't write about any overt protests against him or against music of the United States. I quoted the anti-Semitic paper, which doesn't really qualify as a protest, but it's certainly a negative note in this whole thing, and that wasn't the only one. He does refer to anti-Americanism in Brazil on the eve of 1964, but nothing that is directed at him personally. I remember when I was on a Fulbright in Argentina, I was saying goodbye to my friends at the Comisión, and they said one of the exit questions was, have you been the victim of, or have you been affected by anti-American prejudice? And I had to say no. Then again, it's I imagine it's quite different if you go to a country that is more of a hot spot.
Carla, Pauline?
Yeah, I mean, I will say, look, this has been an ongoing question throughout my life. My father is Bulgarian, my mother's Mexican, I'm a firstborn American. I have felt it on tours, but I've felt it in every capacity. I did my master's in Montreal, my undergrad in the States and in Paris. And at every turn as an opera singer, there were moments when I would get a job and it would be, well, why are we giving our jobs to Americans? If I got a leading role in Mexico, well, or in another country, or, that sort of narrative happens all the time. I think it comes with the territory, and I actually see those as opportunities to really sink in and try to understand, where is this coming from? Why do they feel the way that they feel? I mean, I could point to many a specific story where understanding that perspective led to my having a much better understanding of the history, the background, and the culture of why those feelings were there. And I'm ultimately grateful for that.
Pauline?
I feel lucky to say that so far, knock on wood, I personally haven't experienced that, but I am aware that sometimes that it can be the case, and I realize that I have to be that much more careful with, whether it's in terms of programming repertoire or types of programming, and also, of course, what I say in media interviews on the public diplomacy visits.
I think that's wise. Mike Schneider asks, with increased interaction of American music and musicians with counterparts in other societies, have you found it less necessary to point out what's American in American music and just share ideas, innovations, and your own understanding of patterns? How do you sort out what's American from other cultures these days? And the American there is in quotes.
My question is, why sort it out? Like, I don't think it needs to be sorted. I'm much more interested in actually really understanding where there is this confusion and going toward the confusion with a desire to sort of examine it for what it is. One of the words, I don't think it's come up yet today, but this idea of cultural appropriation comes up a lot in conversations like this. It comes up in pop music, it comes up in classical music. I mean, we could give hundreds of examples, right? But I think that for me, that's where the conversation should start, is by taking a look at that and going, oh, what's going on here? That's interesting, rather than sort of dissecting it. That's just my perspective, though.
Pauline?
Sure. I think that a lot of times when wherever I am traveling, that when I am announcing that I will be playing an American piece, and as I'm about to introduce it, I've been told later on that sometimes audience members, they would feel when I was saying that oh no, what is an American piece going to sound like? Because if they haven't been exposed that much to American music, they sometimes will have a preconceived notion that they might not like it because they might not understand it, or simply because they might not like it. And so but every time I've played, for example, Bill Bolcom's Graceful Ghost Rag, which is a classical twist on American ragtime, it has been very well received. And then I'm told that they like American music, even though that it was just maybe one piece that I would have played. But then at least it opens up some a curiosity in terms of the audience's knowledge of and interest in American music, where they will tell me outright that they knew nothing about what to expect of American music. So at least if we are able to introduce some to them, and if they like it, then it's a plus, I think.
No, I was just thinking, for 4th of July last year, I happened to be in Tallinn, where one of my students is the public affairs officer, and he invited me to a church to hear the U.S. Army brass band, or from troops who are deployed in that area, play a concert of pops. And of course it was Sousa, but what really struck me actually is they played Bohemian Rhapsody, and there was an older lady sitting behind me, and to hear her singing along with Bohemian Rhapsody in a church in Estonia was very, very moving, because you could immediately see how much that music meant to her, and how both the classical and the pop music and coming together, connecting with the West during the time of the Cold War, hearing that music from outside was important, and brought a special kind of connection. So I think I'm going to hand over. Thank you very much for a wonderful panel. There's so much more that we could say and explore, which is, I think, as it should be. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface here. Joel, are you going to trail what's coming next? I'm afraid I can't see my run of show. So.
I think Sherry Mueller has some comments to make.
Right, Sherry. Is Sherry there?
Doesn't look like Sherry's here, Nick.
Okay, well, thanks ever so much for a terrific terrific panel, and congratulations, and thank you, and especially to our speakers. And Carol, good luck with the book, and many congratulations on its publication.